right about now. The Funk Soul Brother, check it out now. The Funk Soul Brother, right about now. Right up now, check it out now. The Funk Soul Brother, right about now. Now.
Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to the Right About Now podcast. This is John Small. Well, we are coming to the end of 2024, and I have been reflecting on this year. What a crazy year. I don't know if I can handle another 2024. I hope 2025 has less surprises. Let's see. The year started off, literally the first week of 2024, I was laid off from a job that I had had for 6 years. And it came like literally the day after New Year's. It was a lovely surprise. It's like, welcome to the year. Okay, now you have to be really stressed out. But you know what? It ended up being a blessing. And I know it's very easy to say that in retrospect. And I feel very privileged that I'm able to say that at all. But the actual incident made me have to rethink my life a little bit and kind of double down on things I'm really interested in, including this podcast. And one of the outcomes of that layoff was that I published my first book. So where some doors close, other doors opened. I was able to make a book out of this podcast called Right About Now. Many of you have bought the book or at least reviewed the book on Amazon, and I so appreciate that. And just a few weeks ago, I got the news that Kirkus Reviews named the book one of the top 100 books of 2024. And so that was very exciting. And who knows how all these things come about. But had I had this cushy job, perhaps I wouldn't have kind of sweated out and put the book out. So this was also the year that my son went to college for the first year, and my daughter started high school her first year. And oh boy, two major transitions in my child's lives, and both have so far gone very well. My son is back from London and his raving. He said, this is music to a parent's ear. He said, if you had to rate your college, he said a 10 out of 10. All right. And that 10 being the best, because if 10 was the worst, I think I might have to go outside and commit harry-carry. And my daughter also loving her school. She was a poet laureate last year, and this year she is a water polo player. I have no idea how that happened, but I'm embracing it. I'm embracing it. So it's been a year of unexpected changes, and I've never done this before, but I decided to put together a episode that sort of takes some of the best moments from the podcast over the year and collects them all in one place. And so you will have the opportunity to perhaps hear for the first time or rehear some moments that I cherished, that I found really interesting and really fun and really inspiring. And I think it's only apropos that we begin with a few origin stories, because as many of you know, my book Right About Now is about the origin stories of some of the very successful writers that I have had on this show, talking about how they got where they are and surprising us many times with stories that are not what you might expect. So let's start off our conversation with a story that did not make it into my book because I didn't know the story until after the book was out. And it is by the esteemed mystery writer J.A. Jance, who has written over 70 best-selling mystery books and is a lioness of the mystery category. And I talked to J.A. at her home in Arizona and asked her how she got her start in writing. Would you mind regaling us with the tale of how you first knew you wanted to be a writer? Because you can trace it back to the second grade in your case.
Yes, my second grade teacher's classroom had shelves full of books under the windows. And if you finished your work first, you could go to those books and bring one back to your desk to read. And it was there that I encountered not just The Wizard of Oz, but all of the Frank Baum books.
Wow.
And what struck me in second grade was that there was a human being who had put those words on the pages. And from second grade on, I wanted to be the person putting the words on the pages. I grew up, I won a scholarship to the University of Arizona because I wanted to be a writer. I signed up to be an English major. The summer of before my junior year, when it was time to sign up for those upper division courses, I was working part-time in the English department, and the creative writing professor came in and I said, "Oh, I'm hoping to sign up for your class this fall." And he looked me up and down and he said, "You're a girl." I said, "So?" He said, "Girls become teachers or nurses, boys become writers." And he wouldn't let me in his class.
That's the worst thing I've ever heard. What year is this?
That was 1964, but I can actually top it. My boyfriend was allowed in the creative writing class that was closed to me, and I actually helped him with some of his papers. He got a good grade. Married him. He never published anything. But in 1968, when we got married, he told me, "There's only going to be one writer in our family, and I'm it." So I stifled. I didn't start writing until after I was divorced, 13 years later. But in my first hardback, you'll be interested to know, a book called Hour of the Hunter, the first of the Walker family books. Diana Ladd, main character, is a teacher on an Indian reservation who always wanted to be a writer. She's married to a man who was allowed in the creative writing program that was closed to her. He's dead at the beginning of the book. And the crazed killer in that book turns out to be a former professor of creative writing from the University of Arizona. Don't you just love it when that happens?
Poetic justice. Poetic justice. I love that story. I love how through your characters you can commit all sorts of revenge. You never want to cross a writer because you never know if you'll end up in the pages of one of their books. So watch it. Watch out. All right. Another extraordinary origin story that I heard this past year was from Joyce Maynard, who is another force to be reckoned with in the literary world. And Joyce is well known for her incredible writing career, but also for the beginnings of her career, in which she was well courted by none other than J.D. Salinger when she was just 18 years old and a freshman at Yale University. And she was a bit reluctant to tell me this story at first, but I don't know. I was able to pry it out of her, I guess, and I'm glad I did because it's quite a story.
So I will say this, and I have no shame around it, or, I'll just say it. I started writing when I was very young and publishing my work, when I was like 13. I was very ambitious, not so much to get famous and make a lot of money, but actually to see the world, to get to New York City. I was a small town girl from New Hampshire. My freshman year of college, and it was Yale, it was 1971. Yeah. I wrote a letter to the editor-in-chief of the New York Times and said, "I'd like to write for you." I was a girl that was too shy to call up a boy, but I felt very confident of my writing. And I said, "I'd like to write for you." And interestingly, he wrote back and he gave me an assignment to write about the only subject I was qualified to write about at the time, which was me. So I wrote this long essay called, it was about my growing up. They named it. The irony of the title escaped me, but it was called An 18-Year-Old Looks Back on Life. They sent a photographer to take my picture in my blue jeans in the Yale Library. And in April of 1972, a date I remember well, there I was on the cover of the New York Times Magazine in full color. It's a little different from being in the New York Times Magazine now when there's so much media. There were like 4 things, and that was one of them. Major. There were 3 TV channels. So my life changed. I got hundreds and hundreds of letters, offers, go on TV, go on radio, sign book contracts, audition for The Exorcist, didn't get the part, which probably was just as well. And then among those was a letter, unlike all the others, that kind of moved me long before I got to the signature, just by what it said and the voice in that letter. This is like a person who got me as nobody did. But the signature was J.D. Salinger. I embarked on a correspondence with him. I was a very young 18-year-old, completely inexperienced in the world. I thought I had my dear friend who just knew me like nobody else did. I was basically like getting letters from Holden Caulfield every day at Yale, telling me I was the most brilliant writer, the most wonderful girl. And this was my friend and mentor and spiritual guide. And of course, I went to see him when school got out and didn't leave. I quit the world and gave up my full scholarship at Yale, gave up a really good job that I had got for the summer at the New York Times, and believed I would be with him forever. And almost from the minute that I moved in, it was a big problem. I tried desperately to be who he needed me to be.
You to be at that time.
Well, the first day I moved in, when I took out my record albums, he said, "You're acting like a teenager." It was during that year with him, when I lived with him, in great secrecy. Nobody was supposed to know I was there. I wasn't allowed to answer the phone. That I wrote my first book, ostensibly a memoir, although in the 160 pages of that memoir, you will not see any mention of the fact that I, the sort of youth spokesperson of America, 1972, had dropped out of her Ivy League college to live with J.D. Salinger. I didn't say that because I knew that would displease him. And 3 weeks before the book came out, on a trip to Florida with his children, he put two $50 bills in my hand and said, "Go back to the house, move your things out. I don't want to ever see you again." And as beautiful and loving as his first words were, those words were the most crushing and devastating. I was not a person of value. And being 18 years old, I was 19 by that time, I took it in. That was who I was because the person I most respected said it. I kept that secret for 25 years. I did carry on with my life. I didn't go back to college. I did not go to New York City, my big dream. I went to a little farm in New Hampshire, eventually married an age-appropriate man, divorced an age-appropriate man, had 3 children in the interim. And when my oldest child turned 18, I had a kind of revisiting of that experience. I had always felt it was my obligation to protect the great man. So much more important than I held on to that view that many people still hold on to, actually, even now. Great man, great books, you don't say certain things. But then when I thought about my daughter at 18, my allegiance shifted to the girl, not me, but her. And I gave myself permission to tell the story that had been the forbidden story. And I wrote a book that was a real memoir that told that story. Some people will call it the book about Salinger. It's not a book about Salinger. It's a book about me called At Home in the World. And it came out in the fall of 1998, when I was by this time in my 40s. But it was a condemned book. Maureen Dowd in the New York Times called me a predator. Time magazine. The one good thing about At Home in the World is now that Joyce Maynard has told the one story of value she has to tell, we'll never have to hear from her again. Wrong. No. If there was ever a moment for me to jump off the Golden Gate Bridge, that would have been it. But I didn't. I carried on and I wrote many books since. I've written many books since then.
She has written many books since then, many best-selling books. And again, shouldn't only be remembered for her early dalliance with J.D. Salinger, but it's certainly a fascinating story and definitely changed my perspective on Mr. Salinger, who is really one of the reasons I got into book writing in the first place, because Catcher in the Rye had such a profound impact on me. And it's just another one of those cases of like, can you separate the work from the man? I still struggle with that with people like J.D. Salinger and, Woody Allen and Michael Jackson. But anyway, on we go. The best of 2024. I'll be right back with my conversation with Kristin Hannah. Right About Now is brought to you by AG1. This is a product I not only promote on my podcast, but when I use, it's like daily self-care for me, because I know that if I put it in my smoothie, I'm doing at least one good thing for my body that day. It's giving me lots of vitamins and minerals that I know I need. And AG1 contains prebiotics, probiotics, and gut-supporting ingredients, which really help support my digestion, and that keeps me regular. I'm going to be honest with you. So I really recommend AG1. You will notice a big difference yourself. And I've got a special offer for you. Try AG1 and get a free bottle of vitamin D3K2 and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first purchase. All you have to do is go to drinkag1.com/rightaboutnow. That's a $48 value for free if you go to drinkag1.com/rightaboutnow. Check it out now. All right, so we are back with the best of 2024 on Right About Now. This past year, I had the pleasure of once again interviewing Kristin Hannah, who is one of my favorite novelists working today, and I am not alone. I interviewed her right before her new book, The Women, came out, and that book has gone on to become like bonkers popular. I think it's probably her most popular book, and this is the same person who wrote The Nightingale, which was also a huge bestseller. But The Women, which follows healthcare workers or nurses during the Vietnam War, it was just named the #1 fiction novel by Goodreads this year. I love talking to Kristin. She's very open about her writing process and about her writing experience. So here's a little tidbit of my conversation with her. Some of the things that you've learned over the years about novel writing, even just as far as structuring them, I'm just curious.
Well, so I've learned that conflict is crucial. And, I'm an accomplished enough writer that I can sometimes write 100 pages with almost none of it. Mm-hmm. And that is a very bad thing. And that is what ends up getting thrown away. So I try to remember, to the extent that I can, that, conflict is what builds scenes, and scenes are what build books. So there's that. I have learned of the crucial importance of backstory to making the front story and the conflict amp up and be driving. And most importantly, I would say I have learned to the extent possible, never allow fear to stop me from doing anything that I want to do.
So important.
Yeah,
so important for life. But I think fear, and I think so often with writers, it's fear of failure. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's probably with most people, but I noticed when I did a survey once of my listenership, which is a lot of writers, and fear of failure was probably #1 on the list of the reasons that they don't write, or the things that stand in their way. And
it's really true, and it's something that has to be dealt with. I decided very early on, because of my fear of failure, to actually embrace it and welcome it and seek it out. And I found that by not seeking failure, it's kind of my way of saying, I don't care what is selling. I don't care what you think will work. I'm going to do what feels right to me, and I am prepared to fail because that feels like the right path to me. And sort of embracing that expectation of failure was very freeing.
Yeah. I think once you can get over that, then I feel like it really just opens the door for you to do so much more than you would normally do. You have,
I was just going to say very quickly, you also have to be careful, because success can intensify the fear of failure. You think as a beginning writer, like, your fear of failure is probably so much bigger than anybody else's. But once you've done this and you know what you're doing and you like doing it, suddenly it's easy to become afraid of what readers think, of what reviewers think, of what your agent thinks. And allowing that fear in can then sometimes curtail what you choose to write because you actually try to write to be successful. And I think that can be a recipe for failures.
Okay. Point taken. If Right About Now becomes as successful as The Women has been, then, I better not freak out and fear that I'm not going to replicate it the second time. All right. Anyway, I love her advice on all counts. Highly recommend you go back and listen to that podcast. It is chock full of wisdom. All right. What do I got next? Oh, this is a conversation that I had with the writer Steve Almond. Now, Steve is the writer of a new writing book called Truth is the Arrow, Mercy is the Bow. And I asked Steven to read a portion from his book that really resonated with me because it was about how much he doesn't like writing. And I think a lot of writers are loath to admit this, but kind of feel the same way, including yours truly. So here's Steve Almond.
Let me start by stating something I hope we all have in common, which is that I find writing excruciating, a form of self-imposed exile with a side order of shingles. I would rather do almost anything other than write. If you are one of those people who doesn't agree with this statement, who finds the hours spent at the keyboard sailing past, well then, I am happy for you in the exact same way you are happy for the person who married your soulmate.
I love that. That is so perfect. And it kind of encapsulates certainly my feeling about writing. And I was so happy to hear somebody as accomplished as you feel the same way.
Mm-hmm.
Why do we write? I mean, why do we do this? If writing is such a chore and so unpleasant, why do you do it?
I think that there's a certain kind of person who everybody's trying to figure out the story of their lives. They're trying to figure out kind of what they're living through and what's happening in the world inside them and how that's interacting with the world around them. And I think as a result of being a species with a big brain and a very conflicted heart and a kind of confused soul, we're going in search of ourselves and trying to figure out the meaning of all these experiences that are rushing at us.
Right.
And the bioevolutionary adaptation is that we know how to tell stories. So we're constantly constructing stories that help us understand and live with, and in some ways try to address bewilderments that we're encountering. And that's what stories are. And we're telling them all the time, regardless of whether we're trying to make a living at or sort of consider it our calling to write them down in one form or another. And literally everybody is doing this storytelling work all the time. And writers are people, I guess, who somewhere along the line probably started reading, getting really excited by the feeling that there are people out there who are playing poker at the big stakes table, who are interested not just in the journalistic questions, who, where, why, when, but the kind of inner life question of why. So for me, I was a newspaper reporter, an investigative reporter, and I was being sent out into the world to write stories about eventually people who were really self-destructive and other destructive. And my editors wanted me to kind of get them and, get an indictment and make a big controversy and scandal. But I kept thinking, why are these people doing this? Like, why are these people blowing up their lives? Like, what's happening inside them that's causing them to do this? I come by this question naturally. Both my parents were psychiatrists who became psychoanalysts. So like the inner life.
You didn't have a chance. Yeah.
I didn't have a chance, man.
My wife is a psychoanalyst. Yeah, I get it.
As a psycho, I like that analyst. You kind of,
yes,
broke that. My wife is a psycho analyst. So I
grew up with that.
Yeah, I can see that very clearly, but it took me, I didn't take creative writing in college, and I wanted to sort of have a business card and insurance and all that stuff and be like a legit professional. And then I just John Prine says, your heart gets bored with your mind and it changes you. So like 7 years into being a journalist, I just started asking these why questions. And alongside that, Jonathan, with, not coincidentally, I had started reading, not because somebody was assigning me to read something,
right,
but because I just was like, oh my God, there are people out there who do this. And I remember, reading I don't know, Tony Early stories and Harper's and, various writers, Lori Moore and Barry Hanna and Dennis Johnson, whoever it was, and just being like, holy crap, these are my heroes. Like, you mean you can do this? I didn't even know there was such a thing as an MFA. This is all happening in the mid 90s. So you can assume my clothing is pretty shitty. You can actually just generally assume that my clothing is awful. But that feeling was like, oh God, there are people who are, they're not writing because somebody assigned them or they want an indictment. They're actually writing sort of a lamentation. They're trying to understand how our love gets distorted into evil. Like, that's really the job here. And that was very exciting for me. And I started sneaking off after work and going to this community workshop that this wonderful writer, John Dufresne, held up at FIU. I was living in Miami at that time, on Miami Beach, and being the world's most inept investigative reporter. And I would sneak off and write these terrible stories. I didn't know were terrible yet. They still seem to me to go, wow, they just poured out.
These were short stories, right? So you got into fiction writing. Yeah.
Yeah. That was, it was it was not too daring an ascent. I kind of I scrabbled up the rocks of short stories.
I mean but that's a good place to start, because it's like a sort of distilled, I remember taking a short story class at Wesleyan where you teach, or have taught, or no, teach, right? And like everything is sort of distilled into that, whatever it is, 10, 15, 20 pages. And it's a kind of almost like a good, it's very hard to do, but it's not as intimidating as like tackling a novel, I think, especially when you have a full-time job doing something else. Yeah, that's what it was. It was, I think at its best, the short story is phenomenal. Like, the best short stories have, in a certain way, to me, the power of a novel, but just compressed. So I find it it's my native form, but some people will say it's sort of an apprentice form. And I certainly can say the novel kicked my ass. I wrote 5 failed novels before I wrote one that I felt was worthy of publication. And the architecture, a lot of the book is really, it's written from the perspective, even that silly paragraph I wrote is really saying, look, this isn't a book where you like go to the guru, Rick Rubin, and he sort of, says the Buddhist incantation, and then suddenly the muse visits you every day. Like, it's not that kind of book. Mostly writing is decision-making alone. You're choked by doubt and uncertainty. And oftentimes that's intense enough that it just literally shuts you down into writer's block. And that too is a part of the process. And you fail more than you succeed. And you're going to get a whole bunch of rejections. And your job isn't to write a bestseller or get an agent or any of that. It's just to outlast your doubt. It's to keep making decisions at the keyboard. And it's really written from the perspective, in other words, not of like, come to me for the wisdom, but more like, I have screwed it up many ways and failed many times. And I've learned something from those failures. And here's what I think I've learned. And maybe you are encountering some of the same struggles. I had the good fortune of talking to kind of a legend right now in cozy mystery writing, a guy by the name of Richard Osman, who writes out of the UK. And when I told people that I was having Richard come on my podcast, they just freaked out. Like, how did you get Richard Osman? And I was pretty psyched because I didn't know that much about him and I didn't realize what a big deal he was. But he is a very big deal for his Thursday Murder Club novels. And Richard's great because he came to writing much later in his life. He actually began his career as a successful game show producer and then became a very successful game show host. And in his 50s, he's picked up writing and has become a real force in the cozy mystery genre. And his books have even been optioned by the likes of Steven Spielberg. So Richard was not shy about opening up to me about some of his childhood traumas and some other challenges that he has encountered along his very successful career. And I always find these stories so inspiring and reassuring and life-affirming because even the most successful of us really have to go through it. So when you're feeling down, just know that many of the people that you admire most had similar, if not even more trying obstacles put in their way. There's a book called Letter to My Younger Self, right? And you wrote about being 9 years old. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened when you were 9 in your family?
Yeah, so my dad left when I was 9, and I didn't come from a family where there's lots of rows or anything like that. So to me, it was like a shock, like a brutal shock. I had no idea. And this would have been like 1979 as well, so 1970s, and people didn't really know how to divorce and separate. And so we never really saw him again here. There was no what we would call aftercare. No one was thinking, I wonder if it's important for those two boys to have their father around. I wonder if that might psychologically be a useful thing for them to have.
Yeah.
And you know what? It wasn't there. And it's no one's fault either. You know what? It was the time, right? He probably could have been a bit tougher about it, but he wasn't. So off he went. And yeah, so I grew up without him. I was very lucky to grow up with a mother who's brilliant and loving and all that kind of stuff. But certainly I grew up without that role model. But what I did grow up with, of course, is an ability there to weave a narrative, because my narrative there is, it's okay that my dad left. It's kind of fine. I don't need this guy. I don't have to worry about my mum crying at night. Everything's okay. And like a lot of writers, you just get very skilled at just shifting perspective a tiny bit, just to say, no, well, let's just look away from this pain and this difficulty and just go, everything's okay over here. Let's tell this lovely story. And trauma, listen, my trauma is as nothing compared to an awful lot of trauma. But trauma is never the problem, is it? It's the inability to deal with trauma is all the thing. That's the thing. If you have trauma, you leave it untreated, then my God, you get a long way down the path before you get any help. And if you're a long way down the path, you're a very long way from where you need to be. And so I think that's the story of my childhood. Part of the story of my childhood, by the way, a brilliant mother who's very loving. So I'm enormously lucky there. But the other part is giving a child who has an imagination, letting him tell a story and weave a narrative that wasn't true and that nobody was particularly interested in unraveling or challenging. And so that, I think, had consequences later in life.
Have you later in life tried to tell the correct narrative there to yourself? Has that been healing for you?
Yeah, for sure. Now, I have, and again, I'm not from the sort of background therapy would naturally be a thing, but in my 30s, I took a very good friend of mine, a boss of mine, I know had been in. I just said, help me out here, because I'm not the person that I need to be. You can spot it. You get so far away from who you're supposed to be that eventually you're either the sort of person who says, I'm going to drag the world over to me. You'd be like a Trump type figure. You just think you're so damaged and you can't find your way back to where you need to be. So you bend the world to you, or you kind of go, I'm damaged. I need to get back to where I was. And so in my early 30s, I started that journey. And A, I'm very glad I did. And B, I think that it's hard to spend any period of time with a really good therapist without really finding out a few things about A, yourself, but B, about the world as well, and about other people and other people's pain. And, you know, as a writer, I love to write funny stuff and I love to make people laugh more than anything in the world. But I also like to write about pain, and I like to write about why people behave in certain ways to avoid it. And I hope that those things, that combination of understanding people's pain and also really wanting to make people laugh and also being fascinated with crime, those three things hopefully come together and explain some of the sales figures for these books. Maybe
there's a lot there, and what you've done is really remarkable. You mentioned, and I don't want to just talk about all the hard things in your life here, but you have mentioned publicly about that you had a food addiction, and I'm curious how that has played out in your life and what that is exactly and how you manage that.
Yeah, and listen, we can talk about the nice things in a bit. Let's get
let's get to all the bad stuff.
Yeah, exactly. People can listen to this on 1.5 speed. Okay. Yeah, I think that if you are lying to yourself, you are creating something that isn't your true self. You do essentially need something to bridge that gap, right? You need something as the world moves further and further away from you. You need something to numb yourself a little bit. And, you know, that's alcohol for lots of people. It's drugs for lots of people. It can be all sorts of things. It can be attachment. For me, it was food, which maybe is because, you know, it all started when I was 9. Now, food addiction, I'm very comfortable that people can believe it doesn't exist. It's absolutely, you must take your own view on these things. And it's often derided. It's absolutely fine. So I have two choices. My reality is I know it's an addiction. I know it's a psychological addiction. There's physical addictions as well. And of course, that industry has spent billions making food more and more immediately addictive. But psychologically, there's huge addiction issues. around food, right? So I know it, and I know it's controlled my life for 30 odd years. So I do one of two things. Either I don't talk about it, which I did for years and years, or I just say, do you know what? Please ridicule me if you wish. Honestly, your loss. However, since I started speaking about it over here, the amount of people in emails and just on the street who come up to me and say, my husband came in the room the other day, he was crying. He just heard you on the thing on this show in the UK. And he said, that's me. He said, that is me. He said, I never heard it spoken about. He said, and I've been ashamed of that every day of my life. And they're in tears. And it's hundreds of people. We only have to look around us in the UK, and we know there's a food addiction epidemic because nothing else explains what's going on. We know how to eat. We know what's healthy by now. We're not going, oh, sorry, I didn't know. Oh, if you eat salads, then we lose weight. Oh, I didn't know that. We all know, right? We all got it. We've got the message. But there's an awful lot of people who are addicted. I'm one of them, and I always will be. And I've had lots and lots of therapy, so I'm cool with it. And I can control it a lot of the time. And sometimes I can't control it. And when I can't, you know what? I just accept it. I'm like, listen, that's cool. Don't worry too much about it. The key thing with any addiction is to rob it of shame, right? I was deeply ashamed of it. And secret drinkers are deeply ashamed. And secret drug addicts and gamblers are ashamed. And if you can shine a light on it and talk about it, then the one thing that you lose first is the shame, right? And once you've lost the shame, actually, you can start dealing with it, because the shame wants you to lock yourself away, and the shame wants you to keep numbing yourself, and the shame wants you to keep, that's the thing that keeps you in these behavioral patterns. And I'm embarrassed about it, for sure. I find it embarrassing. Am I ashamed of it? No. And the fact that I'm not ashamed of it means that I can talk about it when it's happening to me, when I'm in the middle of an episode. I'm like, okay, this is what it is. But I do know that by speaking about it, by other people hearing about it, that it's helpful. And so that's why I'm comfortable talking about it.
Another really enjoyable interview I did this past year was with Valerie Friedland, who wrote the book Like Literally Dude, Arguing for the Good in Bad English. And she was very illuminating in, why we use certain phrases like the word like and seriously dude and literally, and why these seemingly bad English choices are actually not so bad after all. Now, I asked Valerie, who is really an academic, what she had to change in her writing to make it more commercial and consumer friendly rather than academic friendly. And I thought her advice was very valuable and something that I want to share with you guys. So check it out. What have you learned about writing over the years that you could sort of pass on to other writers, maybe even academics who want to get into writing for more general audiences? I've
been asked that a lot by academics because it really is hard to make that transition. There are a lot of people that have a really hard time translating what they know to everyday speech. Yeah. And I would say that my agent was actually the most helpful in that regard, because I was always a writer that liked a lot of humor in my work. And so even I think as an academic writer, I was unusual in being a little less formal in my writing. And I think that's what attracted the great courses to me, is when they heard me give an academic talk. And I used to always try to incorporate humor. And so when they approached me after a talk, I thought, sure, I'll give this a whirl. But my agent actually gave me really, really good advice that I think anybody can use. And she said, show, don't tell. She says, you tell me a lot, but I need you to show me. And what I took that to mean is, what's the image in my head that I'm trying to get to the image in your head? And if I can paint that picture rather than just use words to describe something, that's going to really help you understand what I'm talking about. So the ways to do that, for me at least, were use a lot of examples. Right. Don't expect that what I'm thinking about is going to translate to what you might think about when I say things in a certain way. So if I'm using words to describe something, but I'm not providing you examples of what I mean by that, then I can't control what you're thinking. Right. And you may not think the same thing I'm thinking. And it also doesn't help you illustrate what you're talking about. So I've used a lot of examples. I also use anecdotes that are super relatable. What in my experience gives life to what I'm trying to describe here. And then I also think what else is important is to to not always start at the start, sometimes start in the middle. And, I know that's really the antithesis of what we've been taught in school. A lot of times when, you start your 5-paragraph essay and you start with your introduction, your thesis sentence. Well, a lot of times when I write, I don't have a thesis sentence. I have an idea, and I write to my idea, and the thesis sentence comes along, or the beginning comes later. And I write my academic work that way. And so, when I am starting an academic paper, I never start with my introduction. I always start with what's the meat of what I'm trying to say here. And I think that actually we undervalue that, where you're getting your thoughts out first and you're going to shape them later, but get the thoughts out and try to understand what you're going to try to get across. What's your main point? Because if you don't really understand it, you're not going to be able to translate that to anybody else. And you rarely honestly know what you're going to end up saying until you say it. So don't worry about having that perfect structure. Start somewhere that's most comfortable to you and go with that.
Yeah, don't always write linearly. And I think people get stuck on intros. The intros are hard. Like
they are hard.
Especially journalism leads are really hard. I sometimes get stuck on that where I'm like, how do I lead this story? And I'm like, no, just tell the story. You'll find the lead later.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly it.
One conversation that's definitely stuck with me is my conversation with Todd Boyd, who was a teacher at USC and wrote a terrific book on the history of hip hop called Rappers Deluxe. And fans of this show will know that I'm a huge fan of hip hop, particularly old school hip hop. And so I love taking a deep dive into the culture with Dr. Boyd. And he shared this great story from his time in Japan. And I wanted to share with you. It so reminds me of my own experiences in Japan. I lived there for a year right after college, and going to concerts and watching everybody dance and realizing that most people in that audience had no idea what the person on stage was saying or singing about, but the energy in the room was always just like off the charts. I saw George Clinton in concert there. I saw U2. I saw Madonna. I saw Janet Jackson, and it was always the same. And this story really resonated with me. So check it out.
I was in Tokyo once, and someone had pointed me in the direction of a hip hop club in Tokyo. This is back in the late 90s, early 2000s, maybe. Let's say late 90s, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And I remember they were playing Biggie Smalls. I remember we went to Tennessee. When we came home, Mad Messages was on my phone. Me being the man that I am, took it to the condo pronto, half Indian, called it Tonto, They're like, so I'm like, all right, I'm enjoying that. And I see this woman who's dancing, this Japanese woman who's like just dancing. She's really like, enjoying the music, and she's rapping every line. And it's kind of fascinating.
Right.
I mean, she's really like, she knows every word. And she's dancing and she's rapping, and I'm impressed. I'm like, wow, I'm in Tokyo for the first time. And, this is, as I say, late 90s. And I go up to her and I want to compliment her because I'm like, this is really impressive to someone like me, seeing here I am on the other side of the world, how much, people are responding to my culture, my music, And when I approach her, she smiles and she says, "I'm sorry, but I don't speak English." And I thought, wow, like she doesn't speak English, but she knows every word to Biggie Smalls. She doesn't speak English, but she speaks Biggie. She doesn't speak English, but she speaks hip hop. That was a really profound moment for me because it demonstrated how, in spite of a language barrier, I couldn't have a conversation with her in English. I certainly couldn't speak Japanese. I couldn't have a conversation with her in English, but she knew every word to a Biggie Smalls song. And that to me just spoke to how influential the culture was, and the fact that her connection to the English language was through hip hop. And when I thought about that, I thought, this is why this culture is so significant, because it's appealing to people in spite of the obvious obstacles that might prevent such a connection. It's global.
It is global. And if you read my book, you will find out that the whole reason I got into writing in the first place was because I discovered Rapper's Delight in 1979. And that changed the trajectory of my life. I still thank Kamathi Evans for playing that record in middle school dance in Tarrytown, New York. All right, so I'm going to close this out with a moment from my interview with Molly Roden Winter. Now, Molly wrote a big bestseller this year called More, and it was about her experience in an open marriage. She was in a polygamous, or is in a polygamous relationship. And Molly is very familiar. She's a Brooklyn mom. Both of our kids are in rock bands. Her kid is in a band called Goose, and my kid is in a band called Swan Dive. So we clearly like bands that have bird names. And we're around the same age. But Molly has engaged in a somewhat controversial, in many circles, relationship, ethically monogamous relationship with two other men in addition to her husband. Anyway, when she was putting her book feelers out, she didn't always get the most positive response. Here's what she told me.
When we put it out on submission, the first round of submissions, we submitted it probably to 50 editors. The other thing I love about my agent is he's very transparent about like who we're sending it to and what, there was like a Google sheet that I could watch and torment myself with as the no's came in. And we got a lot of...
I went through this a few years ago. Unfortunately, my book did not get sold, but anyway.
I'll
keep going.
There can be another.
But it was nice to read the and there was nice to see the comments, and they were all very positive, so that made me feel good.
That's
but
great.
It was never a yes. Yeah.
My agent was sending me some of the very negative comments because he thought it was great news. There was one woman who was an editor, I can't remember where, who rejected it and wrote like a 3-paragraph rejection filled with like a visceral negative reaction.
Wow.
She was like, this book was it's disturbing. And my agent, Sam, was like, he sent it to me. He's like, isn't this great? And I was like, why are you sending me this? He was like, no, even the no's are like really passionate.
That's great.
He's like, you're making people feel something. And I was like, okay, I guess that's good. Yeah. And then
you cried.
Right. I was. Every time I talked to him, I cried. Right. He was getting used to me. He's like, okay, go cry. I'll call you back. But we got 2 offers. And one was Source Book, which is a smaller press out of Chicago, which I would have been delighted with. But the other was Doubleday. And when Doubleday comes a-calling, it's hard to say no. And I fell in love with the editor, who's the head of nonfiction. And I was reading some of the other books that she had done. She did Hidden Valley Road, the Robert Kolker about, she does reported nonfiction usually.
Right.
And, has worked with all these Pulitzer Prize winning journalists. So I was kind of like, what is up? But I think what it takes is an editor she was fascinated. She was like, this is an interest. And she was personally fascinated. And she lives in Brooklyn and she's got a kid.
She can relate to it. Yeah.
And she was like, I really connected to this story and we connected as people. And so I feel so grateful that I landed with Doubleday. But like, just for everybody out there who's, I literally had so many rejections for agents and so many rejections from publishers. But it just does take the one yes, and in the person who sees the potential in it and is as excited about it as you are and wants to make it as great as possible.
So I wanted to end this year with a bit of optimism like that. Some of us might have book proposals out in the world and are hoping to get an agent or a publisher. Others of us might be thinking about writing a book, but just kind of intimidated by the whole process. And I try to give you the whole spectrum on this show, from people who are already successful writers to people who are shopping their books around and trying to break into the business. And I think some themes always hold true. And that is, do not give up. Do not fear rejection. And if you build it, they will come. Eventually, they will. Follow your passion. This is what I believe. This is what my father told me. This is what I tell my kids. Follow your passion. So, I am so excited to embark on 2025 with you. We already have a great lineup of guests that I'm thrilled to share with you. And I thank you so much for all your support through the years, and especially this year in a kind of trying period of my life. If you want to support the show, you can always do so by subscribing to my Substack, which is called Small Talk. And it's a very inexpensive monthly membership that helps me at least pay some bills to keep this podcast and this dream alive. Have a wonderful New Year's, and we'll see you on the other end.
What do you mean?
Thank you for listening to Right About Now, hosted by my dad, Jonathan Small. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to his podcast on iTunes or wherever you may find podcasts. Or you can go to his website, rightaboutnowmedia.com, and listen there. This is Ella, reminding you to do the right thing. Thing. Thing.
Thanks, Ella.
You're welcome.
Perfect.